Um, hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another week of analysis from a couple games from the previous week. Before I get started, just want to take a moment and acknowledge the sad news we all heard today about Daniel Naroditsky. He was super influential for me as a player, one of my favorite content creators, and yes, it's really sad. So, with that out of the way, I'll get started with the first game from last week. And so this was a game between two roughly 1,200 rated players. And unfortunately, because I got locked out of my Lead Chess account because I couldn't remember my password, I'll have to be going through my phone. So apologies for any technical difficulties that comes with that. So we had a Jobava London by transposition, and black went for this setup, which is popular, but not one that I'm too familiar with. Usually, when I would play against the Jobava London, I would play with in early either G6, going for more King's Indian E type positions, so something like G6 here, or I would go for C5, just because it's also natural to want to contest the center. But C6 is solid. So C6, E3, Bishop F5, F3. This is super common in the Jobava London. Normally, you hear never play F3 or F6. That's like the Ben Feingold rule. But in the Jobava London, usually white wants to attack and expand on the king side. Ideas like G4, H4, and really just like checkmate black. So white is already preparing for it. In many lines of the Jobava London, white will, therefore castle queen side, and it's a very aggressive setup from white. And black is trying to grab the bishop pair, which is often an idea in both the London and the Jobava London. By the way, Jobava London, named as such, there's a Grandmaster Jobava, and there's another very famous Grandmaster, Ricardo Report. Sometimes it's called the Jobava Report London. But in either case, it's very often that black will try to grab the bishop pair this way, but in this case, it just fails tactically. Anytime you put two pieces, two squares apart, like in this case on the same rank, you have to watch out for pawn forks. And in this case, if you play G4 immediately, then black can use the intermezzo and take the bishop on F4. And so the way for white to win material is you first remove the bishop from the F4 square, and then you're in time to play G4. So white kind of missed an opportunity there. They instead decide to just continue with their development, playing knight GE2, just being prepared to recapture the bishop on F4 in case of knight takes F4, which we do see immediately. So takes, and actually very interesting move from black. I really like this. It's very creative. Normally, you are kind of afraid to expand on the king side this much, but white has already kind of played their cards that they're going to be expanding on the king side as well. And you get free. This allows you to develop your bishop with tempo, essentially. Like, rather than playing G6 and then bishop G7, you basically save a tempo because you get this attack on the knight. And so after the knight goes back to d3, okay, knight d7 first, g4, bishop g6, queen e2. Now we get bishop g7. And yeah, like black has gotten quick development. And by the way, throughout all of this, the computer will scream that basically white should be playing h4, and it's basically just to preempt black themselves playing h5. But in any case, they're playing pretty natural moves. Castle queenside, white's sort of gotten their main plan in. They've committed to some of this kingside expansion, but black hasn't necessarily committed to castle and kingside themselves either. That's why usually, especially in the G6 setups that I was talking about earlier, that's usually when these very aggressive kingside expansions can be a little bit more effective, just because if you can imagine with a pawn on G6, if you get H4, H5 in with white, you'll have a nice hook to help open up the position. Yeah, so for example, white instead of castle kingside could have already started getting in some of the kingside expansion with H4. And so, okay, black finally does go for H5 themselves. Nice strike. Now that bishop G7 is in and the rook on H8 is defended, it does make it a little bit more attractive. Yeah, we start getting some kind of chaos on the board. White does sort of have the right idea. They're trying to open up the position. But yeah, everything's a little bit loosey-goosey. Especially here, black played f5. They're not really addressing the g5 pawn at all. So a nice line actually is takes. And the point is you actually get this very nice pivot square on h3 for the rook. Yeah, these using pawns as levers to bring your rooks into the game is actually a very important idea, and often one you see more in the endgame, but can be very effective also in the middle game. So getting the rook into the game with tempo, you'll get knight f6 in next. Black has a very good grip on the e4 square, especially now that white no longer has any pawns there, so that'll be an outpost for black forever. Black would be doing very, very well here. Okay, queen c7. Yeah, again, also, by not taking on f4 or playing bishop f6 or even just e6, like this, black should probably do something to defend this pawn on g5. It is sort of actually under threat. Yeah, so black does sack the pawn. And if you're going to sack the pawn, the real way to sort of justify that is the fact that you say, okay, white has made a move on the flank, right? And oftentimes the way you punish moves on the flank is you play towards the center. And specifically because when the pawn is on f4, this pawn helps control the e5 square, right? Once you take away from the center, white has less control on e5, and you should always be thinking, whenever there's a pawn move, that squares are left in its wake, right? These squares that are no longer controlled or have the ability to be controlled by this f4 pawn, specifically here e5, black should be thinking about opening up the center with this move e5. And it can be scary because black isn't castled yet, and so you might think that I shouldn't be opening up the center, my king will be exposed. But in fact, white doesn't really have the ability to actually open up the E file, right? They can only make the D file semi-open, and black can just castle queenside on the next move, right? So this would be a good strike in the center, and you want to open up the position because black has these beautiful bishops that are staring right at white's king, and bishops perform a lot better when you have an open position. they're on adjacent diagonals. They're staring at the black king. Rook h3 can potentially come. The queen can attack on the queen side with queen a5 or queen b6. Black would be doing very well here. Just as like a sample line. If black starts taking everything, yeah, I mean, I take black every single time here. This looks kind of terrifying for white. So yeah, instead, black got a little bit greedy. They're taking the pawn on h2, and yeah, if you're trying to be greedy, then sacrificing the g5 pawn for the h2 pawn, I'm not sure is really the best way to go about it. But white had a nice opportunity to sort of actually trap white's king, black's queen out of the game. This would be the better move order to do it. Instead, play knight f4 immediately. But now this rook that's also semi-trapped is able to just trade itself off. But okay, white gets the h-file, but really the h-file is almost irrelevant because the bishops do a good job of controlling the entry squares for the white rook. Like the white rook can't come in on h8, h7, h6, h5. And so, okay, king f7, defending the bishop on g6. So the bishop couldn't be taken the last move because black had taken the rook, but now the bishop is actually under threat. And yeah, that is very, very scary. So the king belongs queenside, right? Like castling queenside, I think is like the most natural thing to do. And yeah, a very interesting idea by white. So white tries to open up the position at the cost of a full piece, and honestly, it's the right idea. Oftentimes, especially in closed positions where your opponent has a weak king, there can be, if you're not willing to sacrifice material, there can be no clear way to break through. So these kind of moves really should be on your radar. And there's a reason why people always say, make sure you consider checks, captures, and threats. This is a capture, and it 100% needs to be calculated during a game. And while the computer didn't say it was the best move available, I think in a practical sense, A, it's very strong. B, it still gives white a slight advantage here. But you have to be very, very accurate to follow it up. So white played queen f2, and the point is that white is threatening some discoveries. Like right now, knight f takes d5 would win the queen, right? But in fact, if black just plays queen d6, there's no good discoveries here. And so yeah, if you're going to make a move where you threaten a discovery, oftentimes we just stop calculating because we assume there must be a good discovery. And honestly, that's one of the like the easiest things to miscalculate. You see that there's discoveries and you just stop calculating. So yeah, queen d6. The point is that white's knight is not in range of any undefended pieces. The only thing you can take is the bishop, but then the king just takes and gets out of the discovery simultaneously. So instead of queen f2, the engine gives some like disgusting line where the queen infiltrates, and actually it becomes similar to how the game goes later on. Oh no, do not delete moves. Okay. So yeah, even though you're not threatening to win material with knight g6, what you are doing with knight g6 here, what you are doing is you're drawing the king further out into the open. So yeah, it's hard to give very general recommendations in these kind of positions. They almost have to be brute forcefully calculated. But the overall point is that you're just drawing the king further and further out. And when the king's further and further out, they become weaker and weaker. But okay, black themselves did not find queen d6. They played, bishop f5, walking right into a pin. Knight takes d5, takes, queen takes. By the way, I hope this is the right move. I couldn't really read the score sheet here, but okay. White's just entering the position. This is honest. The attack from here is pretty spot on. At this point, there may be slightly more accurate ways to play, but white plays king d2, just defending e3. But white's just won too much material. And that's one of the things that you need to also remember, is that white was attacking black's king, and white didn't checkmate black, right? So successful attacks are not always about checkmating your opponent. Sometimes a successful attack, you sacrifice a piece, but we're able to win back a piece as well as a rook. And so you just won material, and now white could even just consolidate and win in a long endgame. But in fact, was able to quickly just checkmate black. Very aggressive opening from white. Clearly it paid off. This bishop takes pawn sacrifice, very thematic, just to sacrifice a piece to open up the king. Great game from white. Any questions about this game? Okay. So with that being said, we still have some time, so let me quickly also pull up my game from last week. And good. Okay. So this game, some historical context. In this position, for many, many years, and it still is very popular, the main move was d6. This is what's called the closed Roy Lopez. And there are many, many lines within the closed Roy Lopez, and I won't get too into it, but in the year, I think it was 1912, Frank Marshall was paired against Capablanca. And as the rumor goes, Frank Marshall had come up with this very devious gambit that nobody had ever really seen before. And he had prepared it for a year, waiting for the right moment to spring it on Capablanca. And after the normal c3 from Capablanca, he played d5. Now this is a straight-up pawn sacrifice, but it's a very, very sound one, in fact, because this is at a moment where, because white has played c3, the point of c3, by the way, is white is trying to prepare central expansion with d4. The c3 pawn obstructs white's knight, and so white has a very difficult time developing their pieces, and because of that, black is able to get a lot of initiative in exchange, right? So always you should be thinking about, don't be super materialistic. Material is only as valuable insofar as it can be actually used in the game. So if they're just stuck on the back rank, not being used, material isn't that valuable. So this has become, played by every single top grandmaster, and in fact to the point that white hardly ever plays into this anymore. And there are a million different anti-marshals, so instead of c3 here, white doesn't even play c3 for the most part, just to avoid going into the marshal, because it's highly theoretical, and black has basically shown that they've equalized in this position. And so, while in the original game Frank Marshall did lose, Capablanca over the board defended very incredibly. It's actually a great game, and I highly recommend everybody watch it just to see what it's like to defend under pressure. This has been explored at very, very high levels for many years at very high depths. So black knows what they're doing now. And in particular, we get this position. So white emerges a pawn up. In the game that Frank Marshall played, Frank Marshall just retreated his knight back to f6. Notice that the rook and the bishop are threatening to take the knight. You have two attackers, only the queen is defending. Over time, people discovered that actually c6, defending the knight rather than retreating it, is the best way to go. And from here, there's two main directions that white can go. The main one being d4, d3 is also possible. d3, there are subtle differences between the two. d3 helps control the e4 square, d4 helps control the e5 square, and you control a little bit more of the center. I won't get too much of the specifics, but all this, by the way, this creates a massive threat on h2, g3. This is all once d4 is on the board, this is all pretty much automatic. And this is the real moment where white has choice. There's like 7 different setups that white could go for here, and each of them require a lot of extensive theory. So that's basically what you're signing up for if you're playing the marshal from either side. You really have to be booked up. So in particular, notice that by playing queen h4 and queen h3, black has induced g3, really weakening the white squares around white's king. And if white could just magically move this bishop over to g2, white would be doing just fine, right? So the fact that the bishop isn't really around to help cover the white squares is a big problem for white. And what white's real goal is get the white squares kind of under control, get the pieces developed, right? White is lagging in development right now. And hopefully white can stave off the attack from black and in the long run emerge up a pawn. And so black needs to play energetically, and because if black does nothing, then in the long run, you just end up in some endgame, then you're just going to be down a pawn and you'll probably lose. So queen d3, bishop f5, queen f1. So this is one of the setups that white can go for. White goes queen f1, helping to get these, h3, g2, these light squares around the king under control. Queen f5, and one of the main moves here is knight d2, and that can already run into sacrifices of knight f4, and so which I knew, and I won't get into all of the theory. But again, being willing to sacrifice pieces to expose your enemy king is a classic theme, and it shows up again here. So I was already aware of this idea. White instead already goes wrong. So this is basically 2 moves. Remember, white made the first real decision of the game with queen d3. And only 2 moves later, white is going out of theory. And in particular, this move is a pretty serious mistake. So bishop d1 is a common idea in the martial, but white is ignoring, so the point is they're hitting my queen on h5, but they're ignoring their development completely. And once I move my queen to the only safe square, I have no interest, by the way, in playing bishop g4 and allowing for a trade of the light squared bishops. Right, my light squared bishop is one of my best attackers. I do not want to get it off the board. So queen g6 is basically forced, and in this position, my opponent started to realize what's actually happening here. So the knight on b1 is currently attacked. My queen and bishop are attacking. It's only defended by the rook. So white has to deal with that threat. The only way they can really deal with that is to develop the knight. If they go knight d2, then I can go knight f4, which is A, not even a sacrifice anymore because now the g pawn is pinned by my queen, and B, white's queen on f1 is threatening to be trapped with bishop h3. So this would be disastrous for white. The move my opponent played in the game, was knight a3, the only other development square for the knight. The only other interesting try for white, which I hadn't actually seen in the game, I actually quite like this idea. White just admits they sort of messed up. They give away a pawn, but technical difficulties. Okay, knight c3. Yeah, you sack back the pawn. By the way, that came with tempo. That comes with tempo on my knight, so I have to react to open up the c3 square for the knight. And at least in this scenario, okay, your d4 pawn becomes weaker, but you've kind of wrecked my pawn structure, and you've helped your knight to develop. So this would have, I think, been at least the lesser of two evils by playing knight a3. But this also just gives me back a pawn in a worse scenario. So I give up my bishop pair, but it's okay because this knight is actually just a monster. Knight takes c3. I've won back my pawn. I've left white with a disastrous pawn structure. And yeah, I really think that white should have tried to keep the light squared bishop on the board. Yes, you do leave me with this kind of monster knight on c3, which is not so pleasant to deal with. But after bishop d2, I was very happy about how I evaluated this next decision. So I did actually decide to take the bishop on d1. And something that you might think to yourself during the game is that, okay, I'll have the better pawn structure, but we'll have opposite colored bishops, and if we get into an opposite colored bishop endgame, all opposite colored bishop endgames are drawn, and so I don't know if I'll be able to actually convert this into a win. Yeah, this would be kind of faulty reasoning. And the important thing to remember is that, first of all, the opposite colored bishops thing applies to endgames, right? And it's not even totally true. There are many opposite colored bishop endgames that are winning. Magnus is a genius at this. He has many games where he's won what seem like totally drawn opposite colored bishop endgames. But actually in the middle game, opposite colored bishops actually favors the side that's attacking, right? And the point behind that is that, like in this case, I can attack on the light squares, and white's dark squared bishop can do nothing to defend those light squares. And so it's almost like I have an extra piece when it comes to attacking on the light squares. And so after takes, And notice the difference in the quality of our bishops, right? My light squared bishop, once it gets on the long diagonal, the h1a diagonal, like for example, bishop b4 or something, it will be completely piercing white's position. Whereas with this pawn on d4, that pawn kind of restricts white's dark square bishop, right? Like, what is this? What is the long-term like goal or value of this dark square bishop? Like, maybe it can come to b4, but once I move my rook away from f8, it's just kind of staring off to space, and the bishop can maybe plant itself on c5, something like bishop. Oh, I can't do it now because it's not white to move. So let's imagine long term, like bishop f4, bishop c5, right? Like, it can maybe stall the advancement of my queenside pawns, but that's basically the only, in the words of Daniel Naroditsky, he often talks about this idea, it's potential energy. And yeah, its potential is just not that high. So, okay, white took the rook, took the knight on d1 with his a rook. That left the a2 pawn undefended, which I simply attack. And okay, white is able to. They just pitch the pawn. If you play rook a1 here, then I'm able to get my bishop to the long diagonal, and white's pieces will be very passive. So white says, okay, it was a double pawn anyway, let me at least get some activity, which I think is the right idea. And so, yeah, at this point, normally in the martial, you think to yourself, from the black side, I am down a pawn, but I have compensation. Here, black is up a pawn, and they have compensation, right? So the positional trumps go to black, the material count goes to black. So black is just doing great here. Here I play this prophylactic move a5, just trying to stop bishop b4, which is one of white's only real ideas in the position. Queen h3. White is trying to stir up some amount of trouble, get the queen into the game. And yeah, in this position, I spent a lot of time, actually. I spent something like 18 minutes. And in part that's because it's sort of hard for black to find a concrete plan here. First of all, there's many candidate moves that you can consider, like small improving moves like h6, just creating luft, f6, just trying to control these g5 and e5 squares, f5, f4 is a very common idea in the martial, also helps sever the connection between the rook swinging over to h5, bishop e6, just, gaining a tempo on the queen and getting the bishop out from, purgatory out on e2. But actually, I really am, this is my favorite move of the game. I played bishop d5, and I'm just putting my bishop on a good square. Like, white now has to always think about back rank issues because it's, white's only left square g2 is now under control. And I just pitch the ball back to white and I say, come up with a plan. White is almost in Zugzwang. Like, white doesn't really have many productive moves that don't create a clear plan for me. So if white really wanted, they could just shuffle their queen back and forth, like queen f1, queen h3, queen f1, queen h3, and ask me to, find a way to break through. And, you know, it would maybe be slightly difficult, like, for example, like, when I was mentioning I want to play f6, like, this has the drawback that it creates, like, you know, this e7 entry point, and if I try to challenge the e file, then maybe the queen swings in, and this is, like, okay, slightly uncomfortable. But yeah, humans don't want to play a move like queen f1, queen h3, queen f1, right? Humans like to see progress, and it's very hard to just sit still and ask your opponent to actually come up with a plan. And no, I'm not saying that this is how white should have played, because I think that black can find small improvements before actually breaking out, like h6, king h7. But it at least would have been practically, I think, more challenging for me to actually find a way to break through. But in the way the game went, yeah, the rook on e5 was probably white's best piece. Now with the rook on g5, I have the benefit of coming into queen d3, and now I have many threats in the position. The bishop on d2 is threatened. If the bishop goes from d2 to e3, then queen e4 becomes a problem. With, you know, I have queen f3 ideas. If the rook on the first rank steps up, now I have like queen b1 ideas. So the queen is a monster basically. And yeah, white tries to stir up some trouble. During the game, the main thing I was calculating for white was queen g4, in which case I didn't think during the game that I could get away with taking the bishop. It's actually a very nice line showing how you can. So I thought that this would just be perpetual. Queen f5, king g7, queen g4. And I thought I had to step back onto the h file. But actually, amazingly, black is able to get away with king f6. And I thought this was very nice when I was analyzing after the game. The queen comes back to g5 and there's no more checks. So queen g4 would have been a decent try, but ultimately doesn't work. Just loses the bishop. So queen h6. Yeah, there's basically two tries for me here. The only two ways to defend the g7 pawn is either g6, which I ultimately played in the game, or queen takes d4. Queen takes d4. It looks like it just runs into perpetual. If I move my queen, the only squares I can move to are, say, queen b2 or queen c3. But then white can keep chasing my queen, and I can never take the bishop. I can never take the bishop because if I do, then I just get mated on g7. But this actually doesn't work, which I saw during the game that this doesn't work, and it doesn't work because I have rook f8. And this is why having my bishop on d5 is so valuable. My queen is not actually threatened because this would just be checkmate, right? So you can see the value. Tactics will flow when your pieces are on good squares. But I just didn't need to complicate anything. And so I just played g6 because white actually just has no follow-up here. And queen f3 is coming next. And black tried their best to stir up some trouble. Rook takes, pawn takes. So now at least they're not getting checkmated. And they play bishop f4. Note that I can't take this pawn because then I actually just lose my queen. Queen g7 is a checkmate threat. There's no way to evacuate my queen. But after bishop f4, rook e8. And now this doesn't work because after f6, and I calculated all of this during the game, but black is able to drive the king out, and eventually from here you play queen f5, and now the dark square bishop's lost, and black can breeze easy up 2 rooks. So yeah, white, having seen this, avoids the trade, rook c1, but now I'm free to take the d4 pawn. White goes bishop d2, trying to get the bishop over to c3, again, doing anything they can to try to check me on g7, b4, just taking control of the c3 square. Notice how I just constantly respond to my opponent's one-move threats, and otherwise I'm just trying to play solid chess. h4, yeah, again, doing anything they can to stir up any kind of trouble, trying to get h5 in. But now I just simplify, takes. Here, I come back to d4, threatening the bishop, and I'm ready now to start pushing my b pawn up the board and promote. Bishop e3, and I calculated a little bit here and saw I had a nice, simple way to cleanly finish the game. Rook takes e3, f takes e3. Obviously not queen takes e3 because then I just trade and promote. And after the check, no matter where the king goes, like let's say king h2, I can just provoke my pawn. So for example, queen g5, here, check, here, queen c8 is the only way to try to get another check in. Promote, queen c3, and then king h6, and I've avoided all of the checks. My opponent made it even slightly easier for me, king f2, and after b3, my opponent realized they can't even try to get the queen out to cost checks, because after queen g5, I would have queen f5, forcing a queen trade, and now my pawn will just promote. So yeah, nice clean finish to the end, but play was pretty easy for me, all because just 2 moves after we were at basically the starting position of the marshal, my opponent played bishop d1. So it just goes to show that, you know, if you're gonna play the marshal, you gotta know more than just 2 moves out. Otherwise, it can be very, very dangerous for you, especially from the white side. So yeah, thanks for coming to another week's lesson, and hopefully some of you will submit more of your games for next week.